When you think of the economy, you probably picture numbers, a line on a chart, a percentage on the news, a screen that flashes green or red. But Karl Polanyi would ask you to picture something else. A cold street in Vienna, a mother counting coins at the kitchen table, a man standing outside a factory gate waiting for a job that doesn't exist, a field that has fed a village for centuries, suddenly fenced, priced, and sold. Because for Polanyi, the economy was never just a system. It was a moral atmosphere, a set of rules about who gets to live safely and who must live on the edge. And the moment those rules are handed over to the market, something breaks. Not all at once, but quietly, day by day, until people stop calling it progress and start calling it survival. Karl Polanyi was born in 1886 in the fading light of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family moved through the cosmopolitan world of Budapest and Vienna, cities where ideas traveled faster than armies and where the old European order was already trembling. The air around him was thick with contradictions. On one side, the promise of modernity, science, railways, banking, newspapers, a belief that rational systems could organize the chaos of life. On the other, a growing sense of insecurity, class tensions, ethnic conflict, political extremism, and the uncomfortable fact that progress seemed to reward some people lavishly while leaving others exposed. Polanyi grew up watching something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: the way an abstract system could rearrange human lives and then pretend it had done nothing at all. In those years, Europe was inventing new forms of power. Not only political power, but economic power, the ability to organize labor, land, and money at a scale that older societies could hardly imagine. Factories pulled people from villages into cities. Urban life replaced communal life. Cash wages replaced reciprocal obligations. You didn't work because you belonged. You worked because you had to. And that subtle shift, belonging to needing, was the seed of a larger transformation. When Polanyi was a young man, he studied law and philosophy. He was brilliant, intense, and restless, pulled toward journalism and public debate. He formed a circle of friends who were trying to make sense of a modern world that felt both dazzling and dangerous. Then, the First World War arrived like a door slamming shut. The empire cracked. Millions died. Certainties evaporated. And when the war ended, the old European balance collapsed into chaos. Hungary, Polanyi's home, became a battleground of ideologies and desperation. Revolutions flickered. Counter-revolutions followed. The social order was no longer something you inherited. It was something that could be overturned overnight. This is where Polanyi's thinking begins to sharpen. Because when political systems collapse, people don't only lose governments, they lose predictability. They lose the quiet confidence that tomorrow will resemble today. And that is when the question becomes unavoidable. What kind of society can withstand shock? In the years after the war, Polanyi watched the rise and fall of utopian promises. Some promised equality through revolution. Some promised stability through nationalism. Some promised order through force. But behind all of them, he saw the same pressure: economic dislocation, hunger, inflation, unemployment, families pushed out of work, out of homes, out of dignity. He began to suspect something that most economists did not like to hear: that crises were not simply cycles, not mere weather patterns of capitalism. They were signals that the system itself might be asking people to do the impossible. And then, in 1919 and 1920, you could feel the impossible in the street. Imagine a crowd outside a bakery. Not the romantic bakery of postcards, but a grim line of bodies waiting for flour. A woman argues with the clerk. A man steps forward, his hands shaking. Behind them, children stare at the window as if bread were a luxury object, like jewelry. Prices are rising, wages aren't. The currency feels like melting ice, and the newspapers keep saying it will stabilize soon. This is not an academic problem. This is life. It's also where Polanyi develops an instinct that becomes central to his later work. The instinct to look at economics as lived experience, not mathematical abstraction. In those years, he encountered the socialist movement, the liberal tradition, the Christian social ethic, and the emerging critique of laissez-faire capitalism. But he didn't fit neatly into any camp. He was allergic to simple stories. He did not believe the market was evil in itself. He also did not believe it was a neutral force. He believed it was a tool, one that could be used, bounded, guided, or allowed to expand until it dominated everything. And if it dominated everything, it would begin to treat people as raw material. That fear wasn't theoretical. It was personal. Because Polanyi had seen a world in which human beings were treated as expendable, first by war, then by political chaos, then by economic collapse. In the 1920s, he moved to Vienna, one of the most fascinating laboratories of modern social policy, Red Vienna. The city government, influenced by social democracy, tried something radical. It built public housing. It invested in education and health. It attempted to protect ordinary people from the harshest pressures of the market. Walk through those neighborhoods in your mind. Stone buildings with courtyards, shared laundries, kindergartens, clinics, libraries. Not luxury, dignity. For Polanyi, this was not merely political. It was a demonstration. It showed that society could choose to shield people from economic insecurity. It showed that markets did not have to be the final judge of human worth. But Vienna was also surrounded by a hostile world. Austria was weak, humiliated, financially fragile. The larger European economy was unstable. Money moved in storms. Capital flowed, withdrew, punished. Even the best social programs could not fully escape the violence of international finance. And again, Polanyi watched a pattern that would become central to his great argument. When markets expand without restraint, they create dislocation. When dislocation grows, society demands protection. When protection is denied, or made impossible by rigid financial rules, politics becomes volatile. People begin to crave order more than freedom. This is not a theory yet. It's a feeling in the air. In cafes, people argue. In factories, workers whisper. In parliament, speeches turn harder. And somewhere behind the scenes, the great invisible force of the era, the gold standard, tightens like a collar. The gold standard was not just a technical policy. It was a moral commitment. Currencies should be sound, budgets should be disciplined, and societies should accept the pain required to keep money stable. Polanyi saw what that pain meant in practice. It meant cutting wages to maintain competitiveness. It meant slashing social spending to reassure lenders. It meant unemployment as a policy tool. And as the 1920s drifted toward the 1930s, the world began to slide again. Like a ship that looks steady until you notice the horizon tilting. People still went to work. Trams still ran. Cafes still served coffee. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, the foundation was cracking. And Polanyi, watching it, was not simply afraid of a depression. He was afraid of what would happen to democracy when millions of people felt abandoned. Because when a society tells its citizens, your suffering is necessary for the market doesn't only discipline wages, it disciplines hope. And a disciplined hope becomes dangerous. It can turn into rage. It can turn into fanaticism. It can turn into a willingness to trade liberty for protection. Polanyi would later argue that this is exactly what happened. But before he made that argument, he lived through the moment when Europe's experiment with liberal capitalism began to implode. The Great Depression hit like an earthquake that kept aftershocks for years. Trade collapsed. Banks failed. Unemployment rose to levels that turned normal life into a daily emergency. And again, the same moral question emerged, now louder than ever. Who is the economy for? If the answer is the market, then people must adapt endlessly to forces they cannot control. If the answer is society, then markets must be shaped, restrained, and sometimes overruled. Polanyi watched governments choose the first answer and watched people lose patience. In Austria and Germany, political forces that promised protection began to grow. Not gentle protection, not democratic protection. Protection through strength. Protection through obedience. Protection through scapegoats. And in 1933, as the continent darkened, Polanyi left Vienna for England. He did not leave because he wanted to. He left because the world he was standing in was becoming uninhabitable. He arrived in England with a mind full of questions and a heart full of evidence. He had seen modernity's triumph. He had seen modernity's collapse. Now he wanted to understand the deeper cause. Not the headlines, not the personalities, the architecture beneath the disaster. And that search would lead him backward in time, into the origins of the market society itself. Because Polanyi believed that what Europe was living through was not merely a crisis. It was the consequence of a grand experiment. An experiment that tried to build a society around a self-regulating market. And the moment society resisted, the experiment turned violent. England did not greet Polanyi with fireworks. It greeted him with rain, brick, and the quiet confidence of an older empire. But beneath that confidence, he sensed the same tension he had seen in Vienna. Only here it was more deeply rooted, more historical, almost like sediment. England, after all, was not merely another European country. It was the birthplace of the industrial market society. If Polanyi wanted to understand how the modern economy had become so powerful and so dangerous, he had to understand how it began. So he began to dig, not into balance sheets, but into parish records, not into economic models, but into laws, pamphlets, and the small administrative decisions that reshaped ordinary life. And in that search, he found a story that most economists never told. A story that begins not with free markets, but with force. Imagine the English countryside before the full arrival of industrial capitalism. Villages arranged around fields. Common land where families grazed animals, gathered wood, and survived bad years. A rhythm of life shaped by seasons, custom, and obligation. There were markets, yes. There was trade, yes. But for most people, the economy did not stand apart from life. It was woven into it. Then comes enclosure. It sounds polite, like paperwork, like neat boundaries on a map. In reality, enclosure was a seizure of shared life. Common land was fenced. Access was restricted. A resource that had belonged to a village for generations was transformed into private property. And when land becomes property in that new, strict sense, everything changes. A family that once survived by combining small farming, shared grazing, and seasonal work is suddenly forced into a narrower path. If you can't access commons, you can't feed your animals. If you can't feed your animals, you can't supplement your diet. If you can't supplement your diet, you need cash. And cash means wages. So the village begins to empty. People drift toward towns. They become labor, a word that sounds neutral until you realize it means their survival is now dependent on a market demand for their time. Polanyi wanted you to feel the cruelty hidden inside that transformation, because it wasn't a gentle evolution, it was a restructuring. And once labor is dependent on wages, labor becomes vulnerable to the price system. If wages fall, you don't just earn less, you eat less, you heat less, you live less. This is where Polanyi's concept of fictitious commodities starts to take shape. Labor is not a commodity produced for sale. It is human activity, human life. Treating it like a commodity means subjecting people to fluctuations as if they were sacks of grain. And England, in Polanyi's telling, was the first society to attempt that at scale. But here is the part that complicates the story. England did not simply throw people into the market and walk away. Not at first. It panicked. Because when you create a labor market too quickly, you don't get efficient adjustment. You get hunger. And hunger creates disorder. So, in 1795, in the village of Speenhamland, local authorities introduced a form of wage supplement. If wages were too low to support a family, the parish would make up the difference, often tied to the price of bread. This is the Speenhamland system, and Polanyi treats it like a hinge in history. Why? Because it reveals a truth most market myths ignore. Society instinctively protects itself. When the market creates unbearable conditions, people do not simply adapt. They demand help. They demand stability. They demand that survival not be treated as a price variable. Speenhamland was not an economic theory. It was a local attempt to prevent social collapse. But it had consequences. Employers could keep wages low because the parish would cover the gap. Workers became dependent on relief. The system created resentment from taxpayers and contempt for the poor. And then, in 1834, came the new Poor Law, a deliberate hardening. It abolished outdoor relief. It built workhouses. It made aid humiliating by design. The logic was moral and economic at once. If you make relief harsh enough, people will accept market discipline. In practice, it meant something brutal. A mother with no work had to choose between hunger at home or entering an institution where families could be separated, conditions were harsh, and dignity was intentionally stripped. And this is where Polanyi's critique becomes sharper than most. He argues that the modern labor market did not emerge naturally. It was constructed through law, policy, and coercion. The free labor market required the removal of old protections. It required the threat of destitution. It required a system in which saying no to wages meant risking your life. Freedom, in that sense, was redefined. Not freedom from coercion, but freedom to compete under threat. Now imagine what this did to communities. When work is unstable, planning becomes impossible. Marriage becomes delayed. Children become economic burdens. Neighbors become competitors. And yet, to the architects of the new market society, this was not cruelty. It was modernization. Because modernization demanded a belief that if land, labor, and money were treated as commodities, society would become more productive, more rational, more efficient. Polanyi's core claim is that this belief was not only wrong, it was suicidal. Because land is nature, labor is people, money is trust. And when you treat nature, people, and trust as if they were things produced for sale, you create fragility at the deepest level. England's factories boomed. That part is true. But England's social life became a battleground. Child labor, urban slums, disease, alcoholism, crime. This is where society pushed back again. Unions formed. Factory acts limited child labor. Public health reforms emerged. Education expanded. Notice the pattern. Markets expand, society protects. This is the double movement in motion, years before Polanyi named it. And by the early 20th century, Europe believed it had found a way to stabilize capitalism, international finance, and the gold standard. A system of fixed exchange rates anchored to gold, meant to discipline governments and reassure investors. It sounded like order. Polanyi saw it as a trap. Because the gold standard demanded that societies accept internal pain to maintain external confidence. If a country faced a trade deficit, it could not easily devalue. It had to cut wages. It had to reduce spending. It had to increase unemployment. So money remained sound, and society became unsound. Polanyi watched this logic turn into policy after World War I. Countries tried to restore the old financial order, as if the war had been a temporary interruption rather than a civilization-shattering event. They forced their economies back into pre-war exchange rates. They treated inflation as a moral failure rather than a political consequence. They prioritized creditor confidence over human stability. And when the Great Depression arrived, the trap snapped shut. A crisis that required flexibility met a system that demanded rigidity. Governments, desperate to maintain gold, tightened budgets in the middle of collapse. It is hard to overstate what that meant in human terms. A man loses his job. He looks for another. There is none. Weeks pass. Months pass. Savings vanish. Pride becomes a burden he can't afford. His children begin to notice that dinners are smaller. Meanwhile, newspapers talk about necessary adjustments. This is the moment when Polanyi's anger becomes almost clinical, because he sees that the suffering is not accidental. It is produced by a system that places the abstract stability of money above the concrete stability of life. And then comes the political consequence. When democratic governments refuse to protect society, people begin to look elsewhere. They look toward movements that promise certainty. They look toward leaders who say, "We will protect you," from markets, from elites, from chaos. Sometimes those leaders are reformers. Sometimes they are monsters. Polanyi would later make a shocking argument that fascism was not merely a psychological disease. It was a social reaction to the failures of market liberalism. Not because markets created fascism directly, but because the insistence on a self-regulating market, especially under the gold standard, made democratic protection almost impossible. In other words, when the rules of the economy are treated as untouchable, politics becomes desperate. And desperate politics is where dangerous solutions are born. In England, Polanyi began to write. He was building his case like a cathedral, slowly, structurally, with a sense that every stone mattered. He wanted to show that the market society was not the natural culmination of human exchange. It was a historical invention. And like all inventions, it could be redesigned. But first, people had to see what had been hidden, that the economy was never a separate realm. It was always a social project. And projects can be judged. They can be accepted. They can be rejected. They can be changed. Polanyi had lived through the consequences of pretending otherwise. Now he was preparing to name the transformation that had remade the modern world. In the middle of the 20th century, while the world burned and reorganized, Karl Polanyi sat down to write the book that would become his reckoning, The Great Transformation. He didn't write it like an economist. He wrote it like someone who had watched societies unravel, because he wasn't trying to win a technical debate. He was trying to explain a tragedy. He began with a simple reversal of the modern myth. The myth says markets are natural and governments interfere. Polanyi said markets of this kind, self-regulating markets, are not natural at all. They are planned. They are enforced. They are held in place by laws, police, courts, and a cultural story that teaches people to accept price as destiny. And once you see that, the whole modern world looks different. The Great Transformation is not about the rise of trade. Humans have traded forever. It is about the rise of a society that reorganized itself around market logic, where social life was required to serve the needs of price signals. In older societies, Polanyi argued, the economy was embedded in social relations. You can picture it. A farmer gives grain to a neighbor because that neighbor helped him harvest last season. A guild sets standards not just for profit, but for honor and stability. A village distributes resources through custom, tradition, and mutual responsibility. Even when money is used, it is not sovereign. But in the 19th century, something historically rare happened. The economy was disembedded. It was lifted out of the social world and treated as if it were an independent mechanism. And the social world was told to adapt. If wages fall, adapt. If rent rises, adapt. If food becomes unaffordable, adapt. If a factory closes, adapt. If a river is poisoned, adapt. To modern ears, that sounds like realism. To Polanyi, it sounded like madness. Because adaptation has limits. A person can't adapt to starvation. A community can't adapt to permanent insecurity. A landscape can't adapt to endless extraction. So the self-regulating market, if pursued seriously, begins to destroy the foundations of society. That is why, Polanyi said, society will always push back. This is his double movement in full form. One movement is marketization, the push to commodify more of life. The other movement is social protection, the push to defend life from being reduced to price. Here is the crucial nuance. Polanyi did not treat social protection as an optional moral gesture. He treated it as an inevitability, because the alternative is social breakdown, and breakdown is never politically neutral. If protection is achieved through democratic reforms, labor rights, social welfare, public goods, then society stabilizes. If protection is blocked, delayed, or made impossible, then society searches for other forms of protection, and that search can end in authoritarianism. That is the terrifying hinge in his argument. Now, to make this concrete, Polanyi returns again to his fictitious commodities, labor, land, money. He calls them fictitious because the market treats them as if they were produced for sale, but they aren't. They are preconditions of society itself. Labor is human life, with bodies and emotions and families. Land is nature, with ecosystems and limits. Money is a social institution, an agreement about value and trust. When labor is commodified, people become disposable. When land is commodified, nature becomes expendable. When money is commodified, financial stability becomes a weapon. Polanyi's point is not that markets cannot touch these things. It's that pretending they are ordinary commodities forces society into impossible choices. Take labor. A pure labor market requires wages to fall when demand falls. But wages are not just numbers. They are groceries, rent, medicine. So when wages fall too far, society intervenes through unions, minimum wages, unemployment insurance. These are not distortions, Polanyi says. They are survival mechanisms. Take land. A pure market requires land to be used for highest price. But land is not just input. It is homes, forests, rivers, air. So society intervenes through zoning, environmental rules, public parks, conservation. Again, not distortions. Boundaries. Take money. A pure market treats money like a commodity, scarce when scarcity is demanded, plentiful when abundance is demanded. But money scarcity can mean mass unemployment. Money abundance can mean inflation and panic. So society intervenes through central banking, monetary policy, lender of last resort functions. Even the most market-oriented states end up doing this, because without it, the system collapses. This is where Polanyi becomes quietly devastating. He says the dream of a self-regulating market is not only unrealistic, it is incompatible with human society. The dream requires society to accept suffering as normal, to accept that people must be priced into work, that communities must be priced out of existence, that nature must be priced into exhaustion. And so, every time the dream is pursued, protection rises. But protection creates conflict, Because those who benefit from market expansion will resist boundaries. This is why, Polanyi argues, modern politics becomes a permanent struggle over the limits of the market. Now, if you step back, you can see why his book hit with such force. He was writing in a world where liberal capitalism had collapsed into depression and war. He was watching fascism rise and fall. He was watching communism present itself as an alternative, often brutal, often effective in mobilization, often catastrophic in freedom. Polanyi did not celebrate tyranny in any form, but he was trying to explain why liberal societies, societies that believed themselves rational and free, could produce such disasters. And his answer was blunt: because they tried to build freedom on top of insecurity, because they tried to treat society as an accessory to the market, because they treated suffering as an acceptable price for sound money and efficient allocation, and people eventually refused to pay. After the war, the world redesigned capitalism. Not perfectly, but deliberately. Welfare states expanded, labor protections strengthened, international financial rules were rewritten. Governments accepted that full employment and social stability mattered. This was not, in Polanyi's view, a betrayal of capitalism. It was capitalism surviving by being restrained. The market, embedded again inside social rules. But Polanyi also understood something that makes his work feel alive today. The market's push to expand never ends. It returns under new language: privatization, deregulation, flexibility, global competitiveness. The claim is always similar: society must adjust, and the consequences are always familiar: dislocation, anxiety, resentment, reaction. You can see it in a modern city where rent rises faster than wages. A teacher works full-time and still shares an apartment with roommates at 40. A nurse takes extra shifts and still can't afford childcare. A delivery driver is independent, free to choose his hours, but trapped by algorithmic incentives and the constant fear of losing access to income. This is labor commodification in a new costume. You can see it in landscapes where forests are cleared for short-term profit, where water is rationed through price, where climate instability becomes externality. This is land commodification, updated. You can see it in financial systems where money flows instantly across borders, where speculation outruns production, where a shift in interest rates can crush housing markets or debtors overnight. This is money commodification, amplified. And every time, the double movement returns. When housing becomes unbearable, people demand rent controls, public housing, zoning changes. When work becomes precarious, people demand benefits, unions, protections for gig labor. When nature is threatened, people demand regulation, carbon limits, conservation. In response, opponents call these demands interference. They call them distortions. They call them anti-market. Polanyi would call them something else. He would call them society trying to stay intact. Now, there is a temptation to turn Polanyi into a slogan, to reduce him to markets bad, regulation good. That is not his intelligence. His deeper message is more subtle and more unsettling. He is telling you that every economic system is a moral decision, even when it hides behind neutrality, even when it claims inevitability. When a city allows homes to be treated primarily as investment vehicles, it has made a moral decision. When a government prioritizes bond markets over unemployment, it has made a moral decision. When a society accepts that some people will always live one paycheck away from ruin, it has made a moral decision. Polanyi forces you to see those decisions, because once you see them, you can't pretend their nature. And that is why his work still bites. Because modern societies often speak as if the market is an outside force like gravity. Polanyi says, no, the market is inside the house. It is built from laws, norms, and power. It can be rearranged. It can be disciplined. It can also be worshipped until it devours the things it needs to function. He is not offering a utopia. He is offering a warning about hubris. The hubris of thinking you can turn life into a price system and remain humane. The hubris of thinking you can commodify the foundations of society and remain stable. The hubris of thinking you can ask people to adjust forever without political consequences. And then he leaves you with a question that is almost too quiet for how dangerous it is. If we keep expanding markets into every corner of life, what kind of reaction are we building? Because if society is denied protective reforms, it will not simply stay calm. It will seek protection somewhere else. And history has shown what somewhere else can look like. So the real lesson of Karl Polanyi is not merely about economics. It is about limits, about remembering that society is not a machine made for markets. Markets are tools made for society. And if we forget that, we don't just get inequality or instability. We get a world where people stop believing in peaceful solutions. A world where the future feels like a threat. A world where freedom becomes a word that only the secure can afford to love. Polanyi spent his life watching what happens when that love becomes unaffordable. He wrote The Great Transformation so we would not have to learn the lesson the hard way again. Not because the market is a villain, but because a society that refuses to protect itself eventually chooses protection in the darkest ways imaginable. And once it does, the transformation becomes something else entirely. Not economic, civilizational.